Hello and welcome back to the Drop Step podcast. Guys, we are officially in September. The NBA feels closer than ever, and we are going to start. I don't know if I'm going to get through all 30 teams on the Drop Step this year before the 24-25 season starts, but really we're starting at the foot of the NBA. We're looking at two teams that are looking to climb the mountain right from base camp. We're looking at the Washington Wizards and we're looking at the Portland Trail Blazers, and I've got two fantastic guests on to talk about this. I've got Matt Moderno covering the Washington Wizards for us today, and I've got Judson Walden talking about the Portland Trail Blazers. Matt, we'll start with you. Season's closer than ever. How does it feel sort of looking at the season and thinking, God, I really hope we lose this year? Is there like sometimes when you're sort of in a really good situation, you can't wait for the season to get started, but sort of knowing what you're in for, knowing you're doing those sort of night to night recaps and everything, is there a tinge of not sadness, but maybe nervousness going into the season this year?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm like weirdly kind of like looking forward to it. I think for the first time, we've got like a couple young guys to at least be interested in what they do. So there's something to kind of look forward to there. I might feel differently a week into the season if those guys look the way one of them looked during Summer League, which we'll probably get to. But yeah, it's cool just to have a direction. Whether that direction is straight down or not, it's still better than kind of what they did for the 10 years prior to that.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And Judd, what about you, man? This feels like the Blazers are further into their rebuild than the Wizards. There've been a fair few years of losing, and looking at that sort of beast of a Western Conference, while the roster might be in better shape, I feel like it might be more of the same this year. How are you feeling about the start of the season?
I feel like in some ways we're still on our way to base camp if we're comparing this to a hike. But at the same time, I think we were so far behind the eight ball compared to where we hoped to be last year. When you move on from a superstar, I think you hope that you're going to be able to get something that'll help you right away. But no, we went full commit into the rebuild, and it was a tough season. And I think the sledding is looking a little bit better, but I think it's still going to be tough going forward. But damn, I'm excited to watch. I already bought my tickets for the Blazers game in Toronto, so nice. I'm ready to go.
Nice. I think that while both of these teams are sort of looking upwards at the NBA and sort of looking towards the 2025 draft this season, one thing that links both the Wizards and the Blazers was that sort of draft night trade that almost instantly got forgotten about. I think the Deni Avdija to the Portland Trail Blazers trade was announced a couple of hours before the draft. We didn't necessarily know the details. Then it transpired that it was essentially for Malcolm Brogdon, the 14th pick in the NBA draft, which ended up turning into Bub Carrington, personal favorite of mine. I pitched him for the Toronto Raptors. He ended up going a few spots before. And I think a 2029 first. I'm a little bit shaky on the protections on that. I'm sure that you guys know. But I think it's been a really contentious trade in the Wizards community. Matt, I've got a fair few people on my Twitter timeline. I think Will Clayton is absolutely gutted that Deni is gone. I don't know where you stand on this specifically. How are you feeling about Deni being gone? And, what does Judd have to look forward to this year watching Avdija with the Blazers?
You don't have some of his more intense fans to look forward to because if you say anything other than he's better than Luka Doncic, you're going to just be called a hater for the next couple of years. So buckle up for that. But Deni, the player, is great. I mean, he took a big stride in the second half of the year last year offensively. I think my thing was always the shooting needed to come around for him to kind of realize the other skills that he had. Like, he's not a quick enough guy to beat people with the ball unless, they had to kind of like account for the jump shot. So now that they actually have to play up on him a little bit, he can get guys on his hip a little bit better. Then the passing's kind of enabled. So that's great. And the defense has always been good. He fouls a little bit less now, which is great too. So I think Deni, the player, will be a lot of fun. And I think he actually makes a lot of sense with some of the other pieces there. He's like versatile enough. You can play him up or down the lineup. So that'll be cool. Just the trade as a whole, though, I'm still a little bummed by it, but also excited about it. So I feel like that's probably the sweet spot for a trade where you don't totally love it. Then it means it's probably fair. But, I think the chances of Deni at this point turning into like a major star are probably not super high. He's just a really good piece. And maybe Bub never ends up being better than Deni is right now, but at least there's more theoretical upside left there to tap into. And I think if you're Washington, you have so little to look forward to and sort of like exciting young pieces that just one bigger swing like that kind of makes sense. So I'm a little conflicted still. I wish they'd have gotten a pick in next year's draft somehow, but that's okay. We'll take it.
Yeah, we need those.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
Yeah, that's sort of touching on that. I feel like this was a trade that took a lot of people by surprise. Usually, when you see these teams in Portland's position, in Washington's position, you don't necessarily expect them to be going out and giving out current and future draft capital. My understanding of it is that Mike Schultz, a guy that's quite high up in the Blazers front office, loved Denny pre-draft, like absolutely loved him, went to bat for him, was probably calling you a hater, Matt, when you were saying that he wasn't as good as Luka. And this just looked like the opportunity where he could go out and get his man. Judd, are you excited to have Denny in town? And what do you think this means for Portland this year in terms of, is it just a statement of intent? Like, no, we don't want to be at the very foot of the NBA anymore. Or is it more a, we think we can still be really bad, get a great pick in 2025, as well as get a guy that's on a good contract, still quite young, fits with our roster?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. Before we recorded our last episode, ironically, we were talking about a potential Denny Advia trade, and then it happened right then and there. So
yeah,
that was fun. We were kind of hoping it was going to be to a contender because I think he does bring a lot to the table. We were talking about him as one of those guys who could get off a bad team onto a contender and potentially be a difference maker, and that's the way that I see him. But don't get me wrong, we're not in a position to contend. The way I look at it, some people look at the draft capital we gave up. We had 2029 firsts. Washington isn't getting the worst of those three. They're getting the second best, though. So in terms of that, we're not giving up our most favorable pick in that year's draft. A couple more seconds over the next few years. I think 28 and 30 were the second round picks. And at the end of the day, what we did was trade the 14th pick for someone who's 23 years old going into his 5th NBA season in a draft that was pretty weak. And our best rookie last year was arguably 23 years old, and that would be Toumani Camara. So at the end of the day, we put ourselves in a position, got a guy who signed to a pretty favorable contract in this crazy new CBA, who, you know, is at an age where sky's the limit for him in a lot of ways. I do think that ceiling has probably been not necessarily determined. I think he can always get a little bit better, but like Matt said, I think he's probably never going to be a superstar. But like you alluded to, Jack, I think we definitely think he can be that type of piece that can make a difference. That doesn't say, hey, we don't want to improve at all, but is also announcing that, hey, we're not going to be good this year, so let's see what assets we can accumulate and hope to be better at least a couple of years from now.
I think that one of the lessons that front offices have sort of learned over the past couple of seasons, perhaps looking at Detroit, looking at Houston before they got the adults in the room, is that it's all well and good having all these draft picks, getting a flurry of young guys through the door. But if you're not really giving them a favorable environment to develop in, that can, one, really stagnate growth and sort of hinder it. But two, it leaves you with this situation where you've got 3, 4, 5 guys all coming up for extensions, and you've never really seen them in this optimum condition where they're almost sort of, their potential remains unknown. Whereas I think you look now and you see Scoot Henderson, Shaden Sharp, Toumani Camara, as you said, and then Donovan Clingan coming in this year. And they're going to have genuine role player pieces to play with and sort of make their lives easier for them, not just on the offensive end, but on the defensive end as well. That's something that I'm really excited about in Portland. I'm a massive, massive Denny fan. So I sort of looked and thought, it's kind of like you said, Matt, you look and you think, that's a lot to give up, especially for a team in Portland's position. I'd have almost felt more comfortable if I was a contending team, like if I'd have been mates with Rob Pelinka, for example. I think he probably would have hung up when I said, maybe consider trading an unprotected first and a first down the line for Denny. You know, this is the kind of guy that could really make a difference. But how do you think your respective rosters are sort of set up to facilitate the growth of the young guys? Again, I think that we'll go to Matt here because we sort of touched on Jeremy Grant, on Denny, on Anthony Simons as well as another guy that spaces the court. Are the Wizards going to put out a team that sort of leads to growth for their young guys this season.
Just one circle back real quick, Jack, if you don't mind. Like, I think the thing for Denny, though, and I thought the same thing when I first thought about the trade, but the contract is so good. If they decide to flip him in another year, they probably get back exactly what they traded in the first place. So it kind of makes sense. Maybe you kick the tires for a year, see if there is more untapped ceiling. And if there isn't, then you've still got a really good player who probably fetches the same return. So I think it's a really smart move, for two reasons there.
That's a great point. Point. I think that he'll be earning around the same amount as TJ McConnell in his final year. So if the Pacers ever want to look and just go, hey, we'll do a straight swap, we don't mind. That somehow is going to work on the salary cap. That's a fantastic point, one that I hadn't necessarily considered. But Matt, are you happy with the vets in the room? I quite like the look of Malcolm Brogdon actually coming back on the other side of that trade. A guy that's repeatedly shot over 40% from three. How do you feel about the Wizards vets this season before we get into the young guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few too many of them for my liking, to be honest. I wouldn't mind them kind of clearing a couple guys out here at the trade deadline. I do like Brogdon specifically because I think if you look at like the archetype player that Bob Carrington profiles as, if he's like a slightly bouncier, livelier, healthier, hopefully version of Brogdon, like I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. So kind of a 1-2 hybrid, depending on what the team needs, solid positional defense, some good spot up shooting, some live dribble passing here and there. Like that'd be great. I think the knock on Brogdon has always been the health. And if you're the Wizards, you don't really care that much. Like if he's healthier, maybe you can flip him for something. If not, he's still like a solid adult in the room. So I think that's good. Getting Valanciunas, I think, raises their floor a pretty good amount. They were the worst rebounding team I think I've ever seen last year. So just having one guy that ends possessions is probably good for them. So that helps. Maybe, Sarr learns a few tricks. He looked allergic to rebounds during summer league. So maybe that kind of rubs off on him a little bit. But do you need Rashawn Holmes? Do you need Anthony Gill? Like, do you need all these other guys at this point is sort of where I'm at. I would start to trim the fat a little bit if I were them, but there's nobody that really hurts you. And you look at kind of those tweener guys. They're not really the older vets. They're the in-betweens, the Kyle Kuzmas and the Jordan Pooles. Like those are your highest usage guys. And you probably can't trade Poole right now. I can't imagine anyone wants to take on a $30 million guy who should probably be like a scorer off the bench for you. Kuzma's, I think, a lot more tradable, but he's also been like a solid locker room guy for them and stuff like that too. And the contract's good enough for long enough that you don't have to rush to trade him. Yeah. But ultimately, do you really need two 30% usage guys on a team with this many young mouths to feed? So if one of them moved on here before the deadline, I don't think I'd be, heartbroken by that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Judd, I'm going to get straight into it, and I'm going to ask you, out of these two teams, who's got the best player?
Who's got the best player? That's tough. One of the things I was looking at today which is the fact that no one on either of these rosters has sniffed an all-star game. I think that's somewhat surprising when you hear a name like DeAndre Ayton, former number 1 overall pick, guy who's averaged 18 and 10 at least one point in his career. That all being said, it's, I think, a matter of who has the highest ceiling might determine who's the best player on either of these rosters. If you're asking who I think can be the most serviceable NBA player right now, I would tend to lean toward either Malcolm Brogdon or Kyle Kuzma. So that makes me feel like Washington. But when you talk about that ceiling, it's like who has that best prospect that could be that best player? I don't know. I definitely have a bias toward a few guys on the Portland roster. But I would say right now, it's tough. I want to say Brogdon or Kuzma, going with my gut.
Matt, what about you? It sounds like you're hardly going to be attached to the floor of the Eastern Conference with guys like Malcolm Brogdon and Kyle Kuzma on the team leading the way. Do you feel the same way, or have you got some respect for some of the Portland guys?
I'm 100% with Judd here. I think I would take the short term right now.
Right.
Washington maybe has a couple guys that are like a smidge better. I would trade everyone on the Wizards, to be honest with you, maybe other than Coulibaly for Shaedon Sharpe, though. Just a big Shaedon Sharpe guy. So I would happily take that. And I think there's a reasonable chance where if he just takes a little jump this year, he could easily be the best guy of the guys we just talked about. So
I think that's a very fair point for sure. And the only hesitation I had in saying Shaden was just the defense. And we got into it a little bit when we were talking before the recording about a certain positional battle in Portland that's going to get potentially very messy, but we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think that looking at the two rosters, they've both gone very different ways in terms of starting the rebuild. I think before we started recording, Matt, you said that Portland are a little bit further along. They've perhaps accumulated a little bit more talent, but in doing so, they've got, I would say, quite a bloated cap sheet for a team, sort of, especially in the immediate future, that's not necessarily got play-in aspirations going forward. You know, Jeremy Grant locked down to something like 4 years. I think the contract was like 5 years, 160 million, something along those lines. DeAndre Ayton on big money, Anthony Simons sort of due an extension at some point too. Whereas I look at the Wizards, and while you've mentioned a lot of vets names there, there's nothing really that harmful on the roster aside from that Jordan Poole contract, which I believe expires in 26, 27. And in terms of like future asset accumulation, I think that almost leads towards the Wizards being in a better spot to do deals like the Daniel Gafford deal last year, where they agreed to take on a little bit of a non-factor on the court and Rashawn Holmes because they've got space for him, both on the cap sheet and sort of on the roster. Judd, are you at all worried that sort of sailing this close to the tax line, it's going to limit the Blazers going forward? Or do you think they're going to be able to offload more salary just like they did in the Denny trade?
Well, this is actually one of the things Matt and I were touching on right before we started recording, and specifically in regards to the Denny trade, because what happened in that trade for both teams was it definitely had major cap implications. What it did for Portland was it got them under the luxury tax line and under the first apron. We don't have cap space, don't get me wrong, but we're in a position where we can move off some of those big contracts because we are not hard capped. At the way I understand it, at least. I could be wrong. I'm no cap expert, but we can move off of some of those bigger contracts with potentially more flexibility, I think, as long as we can find a trade partner. Whereas what happened with Washington, they got hard capped in that trade at the first apron because of Brogdon making more than Optia. So, yeah, because of that situation, I don't know exactly what flexibility Washington has. I know that the Sadiq Bey contract had unlikely incentives in it, and I think Kuzma and Poole both have unlikely incentives in their contracts that actually help Washington now align where their luxury tax limit, I think, is pretty in line with their cap space. So they can make a move, but I don't know exactly what restraints they have on the move that they can make. So sorry if I lost your question in there, Jack, but it's an interesting trade that really had major cap implications. So yeah,
I think it probably helped Portland in the short term do something for this year and kind of limits Washington a little bit more in the short term. But for next year, the Wizards end up with 26 million in cap space, so they can do some things next season. And I think this year is all about just like internal growth, sit tight, be bad, and get another like top pick. Whereas like if you're Portland, like I think you can start to do some things here, and there's maybe some more guys that are appealing to other teams in the league that aren't a part of the long-term Portland future.
Yeah.
But also you have like just better, further along young pieces. So like I think you can live with that. Like, you know, we'll see what these guys are like, evaluate them, and then if we need to make a move or trade for something, we could do that.
Yeah, which is nice. Oh, sorry, Jack. Yeah.
No worries, man. I think every time I talk to you, I ask you which player is more likely to be traded, Jeremy Grant or DeAndre Ayton, because they're the two sort of glaring names that sort of really sort of launch out to me. I don't know. I look at that Grant contract and I almost think that is starting to look like a bit of an albatross. I'm not talking Zach LaVine albatross, but the amount of years combined with the age, there'd be some concerns for me. And sort of until the Pelicans get an actual center, I'm always just going to have it in the back of my mind, like they could so easily move Brandon Ingram to a third team. Bang, DeAndre Ayton comes into that salary slot and they're sort of sorted. So it almost seems like there's a little bit of a reprieve there in terms of a get out of jail trade free card. Are you worried about either of those two? And which of those two do you think might be more likely to be on the move this year?
I think you hit the nail on the head there in a lot of ways, Jack. I think even though Jeremy Grant brings a lot as a perimeter defender, he's serviceable as a defender. You can switch him a little bit. He provides some offensive threat. Like, he's a very serviceable player. It's just whether or not that cap or his cap hit is manageable on whatever roster he's on. It's tough. I think the contract is what makes him a hard piece to move. I think if he was on Denny's contract, every single team in the league would want him. But to a certain extent, obviously. But I think that makes him hard to move. Whereas you look at DeAndre Ayton, he's still 26, 6 years in the league, former number 1 overall pick. He brings, when he wants to, a very strong presence on the inside. He can rebound. He can defend. It's just whether he commits to those things. I think because there's an obvious need and some teams that for some teams who have the ability to make a move, all of the Pelicans. I know you and I had a whole Twitter back and forth about that at one point.
Yeah.
I think Ayton is very movable. I do think that there's a lot of concern about his commitment to the game and everything like that that makes him a little bit of an unattractive option to some teams. So I think Ayton, long story short, is the more appealing guy as a piece to be moved right away. But yeah, you don't really with all, again, to fall back on this CBA stuff. It's like the stars kind of got to align for a move.
Yeah, you've also got Donovan Clingan, Robert Williams III, and everybody's favorite Duop Reith. Duop Reith is a guy that I constantly have in the trade machine just because it's like $2 million cap hit, can come in, be someone's third big. He's tradable to 29 other teams in the league. But I definitely think that Ayton is the guy that's more likely to be on the move because you don't draft Clingan, you don't sort of turn down the offers that Memphis were reportedly interested in making as well, to then having to sort of go and sit on the bench and vie for sort of second, third big minutes, because Ayton actually had a really strong end to the season, at least from a statistical point of view. 22 points per game, 12.5 rebounds, nearly 60% from the floor. If you look at the dreadful plus minuses for all of the Portland players post All-Star, he was actually in sort of the upper echelons there. Just a really hard player to figure out, like archetype wise. It almost feels like if he was born 20 years earlier, we're looking at a multi-time all-star. But the fact that he's neither sort of happy being this really pick and roll heavy big or this sort of handoff hub, he wants to operate like a Patrick Ewing. He wants to operate like a David Robinson. And that's sort of only really reserved for Joel Embiid these days. So it just feels like a little bit of a high wire act in terms of trying to find the best situation for him. Matt, I'm going to ask you, because you said that you were excited about having these young guys finally in the building in Washington, guys to root for. Who do you think has the best prospect out of these two teams?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer right now. I might feel differently if we get to see another year of Koulibaly and maybe he takes a jump. He's just really raw. So I think that's kind of tougher to tell at this point. Like, I think he's probably defensively right now where Sharp is offensively, and they're both pretty bad on the opposite side of the ball. So it's just kind of like a tough comparison. I think, like I said, I really like Sharp, though. That's probably the guy I'd be most intrigued by. I also just never seem to catch a good Scoot Henderson game this year. So it's hard for me to weigh in on exactly where Scoot is at in that sort of development piece. I think obviously the long-term potential is awesome, but still like a jury's kind of out thing on exactly where he's at and how long it might take to get there. So the thing with Sharp is, like, I think he can produce for you a decent amount right now on that rookie deal. Whereas like the Scoot or Koulibaly really do much for you in terms of like production in the first 2 years here, kind of maybe less so.
Say a mini prayer for Alex Sarr that doesn't get a mention there. Matt, were you that put off by sort of the Summer League performance, or do you just think that this is a real sort of work in progress player here?
I don't think the ceiling for Sarr is necessarily all that high. I think the floor, like, to me, he's like a good fourth starter kind of guy by the time he peaks out, like maybe a third starter if you get lucky, just because I never really bought into the offensive ceiling the same way. I think defensively he'll be awesome, and it's somebody that like every good playoff team needs, is a big that can switch all over the floor, protect the rim a little bit, not get cooked on screens completely. So I think he's a great piece. It's just, you've got to be a really good two-way player as a big, I think, to be, that sort of like all-star caliber guy. And I just don't think he'll do enough there. Like the best thing from him in summer league was like short roll passing, and I don't know, maybe that makes you like a Derek Lively equivalent, not necessarily like a Joel Embiid. So I just don't think I think the chances of him being a bust are actually pretty low. I just think it'll take him some time to be solid. But if he maxes out as like prime Robert Williams, like that's a good player, but
yeah,
it's not it's not the ceiling these other guys have, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to reconcile that with the fact that, Bilal was picked, I think, 7th in 2023. The average layman fan, even with what we've heard about the 2024 draft, will look and go, well, no, that guy was the number 2 pick, and that guy was the favourite to be the number 1 pick for most of the 2024 draft cycle. But I think that you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of the absolute sort of all-star, all-NBA upside at the moment, sort of as a 4, is quite hard to see. But then again, there's a lot of physical development to come. It's an investment in tools with Alex Sarr. And I think it really signals something to do with sort of the Wizards' philosophy, because back-to-back drafts, you've got Bilal Coulibaly, you've got Alex Sarr. They clearly had an understanding that he didn't want to play the 5 coming into his NBA career. So if you pencil those guys in as the long-term 3 and 4, if everything breaks right, you're starting to look at this team that's really invested in democratic rim protection, where everyone on the floor, regardless of where they are, regardless of who the low man is, can sort of deter shots around the rim. Mm-hmm. I quite like that from a philosophy point of view. It's something that I personally lean a little bit more towards. Judd, I think that as Portland have done since the days of Rasheed Wallace and Arvydas Sabonis, it seems that they're going one big guy, lots and lot of little guys sort of flurrying around. How do you feel about that? And how do you feel about sort of the faith that Portland seems to have in Donovan Clingan?
I'm interested to see where it goes. I think his ceiling is hard to really determine, because I think some of the things that we felt he was limited on, I think he kind of showed flashes like, oh, maybe there's a little bit something more there than we thought. That being said, I don't see him as someone who has this all of a sudden super high ceiling. I think you and Chuck touched on it well in regards to Alex Sarr in your last podcast, Jack, when you I think it was Chuck who said Alex Sarr, he heard the unicorn term thrown around quite a bit in regards to Sarr, but when you look at the other guys who have been called unicorns before him, like how did he stack up against those guys? I don't know that. I think Chuck might have said he doesn't really compare to any of them. I don't necessarily know. I fully agree with that, but I do think that is a fair point. I think that same point can be attributed to Clingan in terms of his ceiling. There's a reason he went 7th in this week draft, and I'm excited to see what he can bring to the table. I do think it makes us flexible with DeAndre Ayton in terms of the guys we have to put around him in that small ball mentality. I do understand it's kind of the way the league is trending, but unfortunately, the guys we have on our roster aren't the guys you can really play that style of ball with and hope to really win. So that means bare minimum, if Clingan is a focal point, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. In terms of Scoot, he played 22 games at 20 years old. He played 40 at 19. I definitely think Scoot's going to get better. I think even so, he's not some otherworldly defender that, bridges that gap. He's not super long. You know what I mean? You know what you're getting with him. You can't put him and Simons on the floor together. You give up too much size-wise. You can't put him and Shaden together because you give up maturity and experience and you're punting the season essentially. You can't start all 3. You can't put Shaden at the 3 because you're a defensive turnstile and there's nothing you can really do. So it really means we're going to see some interesting lineups. I'm going to be intrigued to see exactly who's going to be the starter. I think you have to start Ant if you keep him, but we'll see how that goes. we can put Kamara in there. We can put Tease in there. That provides us a point of attack defender, a guy who can also play the passing lanes really well, and Tease. Kamara definitely has some lateral concerns. I think his footwork needs to get better on defense, but holy hell, he reminds me of Herb Jones in a lot of ways. Just that tenaciousness, his ability to recover an explosion doing so is awesome. So that makes me have a little bit of faith in what we can do in a cling and focus lineup if that happens. Mm-hmm. But that all being said, like I started out saying, if Klingon is going to be a focal point going forward, if it ends up trending that direction, there's so much more work that needs to be done.
Yeah, like you said, it's almost like you've to come back to the climbing the mountain analogy. It's like you forgot your boots in the car. You're halfway up, and you've got to go back down and get them again. That kind of thing. We're really restarting, but I think that unfortunately you both watched some of the worst sort of plus minus point guards in the league last year in Jordan Poole and Scoot Henderson. Both guys that I think got slightly better towards the end of the season. How are we feeling about those two long term? Because that was sort of the first real statement move from the front office, wasn't it, Matt? Sort of going for that Jordan Poole trade, bringing him in. I really like the work that sort of Michael Winger and co have done thus far, but that seems to be, there's nothing wrong with the gamble on upside, but at the moment it doesn't look like this gamble is paying off.
Yeah, I think in hindsight, you could say they might have been better off just trying to keep Chris Paul and waive him halfway through the year and eat the cap after you buy him out. But rather than be stuck with Poole longer term, but I don't know. It could salvage itself if they kind of let him be more of an on-ball guy. Maybe with a year or two left on the deal, some team can talk themselves into eating that $30 million. I think that's kind of where somebody will be with Ayton. It's a little easier with a year or two left to say like, okay, I can take on $35 million for a player that has, some question marks still. But with Poole, like, it's just tough. Like, if I'm a team, he's basically shown he has to be an on-ball, high-usage guy to have any real positive impact on a court. And how many teams are going to give him the keys and just say, like, go be an offense by yourself? It's just, it's tough. And his sort of best suited role then is probably as like a microwave scorer off the bench. But are you going to pay $35 million for a guy to do that? So that's the thing with Poole. Like, he's a little, he's old enough now. Like, how much better is he really going to get? So even if he's the player you saw the second half of the year, which was a lot better, it's still only going to get so much better from there, I think. So it's just a tough spot to be in. I think the problem, or the nice thing is, though, like, his deal's probably up by the time the Wizards are ready to be like trying to be good again. So worst case, if you just kind of run the contract out, that doesn't hurt you that much. Where I think Jud's got the little tougher one there with Grant, because he'll be 33 by the end of that deal. You've got him through 2028. I think presumably they'd like to be good before that time frame. So you could deal with like the one Ayton contract. That's easy to work around. Having both there, I think that's a tougher challenge than the one Washington contract.
Can I ask what happened with Poole through the season last year? Where did you see him improve? Because it felt like early on in the season, some of the sort of different interpretations of like the dribbling rules were really, really hurting him, where it was like, oh my God, the poor guy's getting targeted for at least a carry a game. And then when I saw the sort of like foul baiting rules, I thought it's going to be even harder for him to get to the rim, even harder for him to draw contact. This could get really, really ugly. How did he sort of salvage his debut season in Washington towards the end of the year?
It was just one of those things where I think he was put into a role he's not, one, equipped to play, and two, definitely not used to. So he was forcing things when he did get opportunities. So like Tyus Jones was actually pretty good last year. It just, the two of them together was like a total dumpster fire. And now you've got Poole being slightly more off ball. So when he did get the ball, I was like, okay, I have to attack no matter what. Let me put my head down. And everyone knew he was going to try to score. So like his dribble moves weren't getting him anywhere. He didn't shoot particularly well. So guys were sagging off of him a little bit. He's not super explosive, as an athlete. And I just remember like one particular game early in the year against the Celtics, like there was a possession where he was trying to like back down Drew Holiday, and he like fell down twice because Drew was strong as shit and didn't move. And then the one where he tried to like no look shoot a deep three over Porzingis and got blocked. Like he was like a Shaqtin' a Fool all-star for the first, third of third half of the season kind of thing. And then ultimately they said once Tyus Jones got nicked up a little bit, like, okay, Poole, here are the keys. They brought him off the bench for a while. I think they gave him a little confidence, and they just said, like, your role is now very simple. Like, just create offense. Like, don't have to worry about moving off ball or cutting or anything else. Just do what you do. And I think that's sort of like reverting back to his like bench role in Golden State kind of helped him a decent amount. It still wasn't great, but it was definitely like a market improvement over the first half of the year.
Sort of coincided with this pivot towards really small lineups as well. I know for a period of time, Danilo Gallinari was the starting five in Washington, which 10 years ago, that would have been dicey. My God, 23, 24, that was one hell of a move by the Washington coaching staff. But this idea of sort of like opening up the court for everyone to have free driving lanes, at least have credible spacing out on the floor. And while like we all have this sort of perception of Jordan Poole when he got traded, never actually really ran a ton of pick and roll with your conventional pick and roll big. So you go and you pair him with Daniel Gafford. It's like, I'm not 100% sure what to do here. I've got to build up these reps, and that can look really ugly when you're trying to figure that out on the fly on one of the worst teams in the NBA. Judd, I thought that the Blazers did something similar towards the second half of the year with Scoot Henderson, where what I noticed was they were trying to pair him up with Jabot Reith as much as possible, again, to give him this sort of pick and pop big, more open driving lanes. Were you more encouraged by Scoot Henderson with a spaced out floor, and were you more encouraged by him sort of in the second half of the season?
Definitely more encouraged by him in the second half of the season. I'm still trying to gauge where exactly I think that ceiling is going to be, but I think he brings a lot of energy and a lot of positive attributes to the table that, any coach would want to have. I think Chauncey hit it on the head when he said, he's going to need time to develop. And like I alluded to earlier, he played 40, I think at least 40 of his games at 19 years old. He's played less than 25 games in his NBA career at 20. Like, he is young. I love his energy. I love his attitude. I think he's a really positive presence in that, in our organization and everything. So I'm happy to have him in that regard. I just am trying my best to remain patient, and am really anxious to see exactly, because I do expect him to be the starting one. I want to see how he starts out of the gate and what we start doing with him. I want to see the playmaking get better before the scoring does, which I feel like isn't always what you want to see. You want to know he can hang his hat on, getting a bucket for himself, and usually that will open the floor up for other guys too. But I think that he needs to improve a lot in that regard in terms of just setting the table, distributing the ball. I do think that's part of why they got Klingon, another guy. Don't get me wrong, he's not known as a joker by any means, but some of what he showed as a passer can help open up the offense a little bit. He's not a plus shooter, so he offers a different type of screen setter for Scoot in those high pick and rolls. We'll see how that plays out. But I do think you got to give him the keys. We got to see where it goes, because I think that's going to answer what direction we need to go in sooner rather than later.
I personally would definitely be going in the Scoot direction, and it's no sort of shade towards Anthony Simons, but I think that we've maybe seen enough of Simons as the primary guy to sort of figure out that, not in the same sort of Jordan Poole style, but I don't know if he just has that natural playmaking feel on ball to carry that high a usage in the NBA and sort of lead a fantastic offense. He's one of those really deceiving players where you look at his numbers and you see like, hey, 23, 24 points per game, nearly 40% from three, over 90% from the line, a good amount of assists. But I went back and I watched some of the tape today, and there are different kinds of assists in the NBA. And I really looked and I thought that some of the assists that Anthony Simons was sort of getting credited with, it's more, that's something that's being tuned into the offense. That's like getting a guy the ball in his spot or a slightly more obvious read. Whereas with Scoot, I know that the turnovers were astronomical, like post All-Star break, 4.5 turnovers per game in 30 minutes per game, 31.9 minutes per game. But that's sort of league leading territory, but 7.1 assists per game and 15.6 potential assists per game, whereas Anthony Simons had 9. So I think that there are sort of some statistical indicators, and certainly when you sit down and you watch some of the highlights, you look and you see that Scoot does have that passing instinct. And while it was really, really rough to start the year, like the shooting has started to come along, the confidence is there. And the other thing that I really love about Scoot Henderson is he's one of these guys that maintains his dribble really deep into the paint. Some guards in the NBA, they sort of like, they pick up their dribble a little bit early, almost in that floater zone, and it really limits their options. And I think that long term, a guy that is willing to take those risks, sort of in the style of a Ja Morant, and really, really try and puncture a defense, almost in the way that like Steve Nash used to do, where he'd even sort of dribble it under the basket and come back out again. I can see why he had a terrible debut season in terms of the expectation and the analytics and the contribution to winning. But simultaneously, I can see why the all-star upside is there, and why I think he should be the starter in Portland next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to circle back on that too, comparing Simons and Poole, because I think that they are players that draw a lot of comparisons. I do think that there's some finesse to Ant's game that Poole is lacking maybe a little bit in terms of the scoring, but I think absolutely Poole presents more as has more potential as a true one. So I think they're very comparable players. I think they both lack so much defensively too that, you know, it's hard to be able to move those guys, which ultimately it looks like both teams are in a position where each of those guys has to go.
Poole's the worst, probably worst defender. I mean, but like that's a really low bar, and he's the worst shooter, and he makes 10 million more a year, and he's older. Like if I'm a team and I need some instant offense, I can at least convince myself like, all right, maybe we don't give like Simons the same usage on our team, but at the very least, can he come in and shoot at like a Buddy Hield level? Yeah. Like he's a really good,
very good,
9 attempts a game. He's going to make almost 40% of them, if not, more potentially. And like an offense where he doesn't have to be the focal point, like that'd be great. Whereas like Poole, even when he had like other guys to draw attention, he still wasn't like a knockdown shooter. I mean, he was better, with other, actual weapons around him, but still like his career high is 36.4%. And I would imagine for Simons, like that's probably, on the low end of what he shot at any point in his career, would be my guess without looking, but I'm going to look just to make sure. Yeah. Okay. So Simons had the 1 year at 33% in his sophomore year, but every year since that, he's been, around average around 40. So
on volume too.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of volume.
Matt, I think that while like we spoke about Scoot really, really struggling in terms of contributing to winning, I know that the Wizards didn't, challenge the Warriors' record of 73-9 last year, but Bilal Coulibaly at least didn't take a ton off the table last season. He was sort of serviceable, coming in, playing strong minutes as your fifth starter, as your role player who's having the least usage. What were you really encouraged about by Bilal, and what are you looking to see this year in terms of what's the next step for Coulibaly?
Yeah, I wish they had started him more and earlier in the year, to be honest with you. We had kind of a lame duck coach in Wes Unseld, and I don't even mean that as like a criticism of him. It was just like everyone knows this is not the long-term guy here pretty early in the year. So Coulibaly only started 15 of the 63 games that he was available for, which is kind of criminal, to be honest with you, because he was arguably like one of their two best defenders with Denny. From the start, which says a lot about him and says a lot about where their defense was at, that a rookie was that impactful. I think the thing with Coulibaly, like Denny is a really good individual defender to me. Like he's going to contain his guy, but he doesn't like raise the floor defensively for other, for the whole team as a whole. And so I think whereas like Coulibaly, he's probably a little more impactful off ball for you just because of the length and athleticism, and eventually can kind of help, raise your overall team defense a little bit more. So like there were some matchups where he got abused, but he still looked like into it and engaged and liked to take on tougher matchups. Like there was one game where like I remember Luka trying to like back him down from the 3-point line, and he just had his way with him because one, Luka's strong and Coulibaly just isn't yet, but he seemed like locked into it and to be enjoying the matchup. And the Wizards have gone so long with like without athletic wing defenders who would like to defend people. So that was just like encouraging, from the start.
Judd, what are you thinking about in terms of when we're comparing these two teams? Do you think that the Blazers have done a better job than the Wizards so far in their rebuild? I mean, it's hard to judge on an even keel because they've had a little bit more time to do it. But would you swap places right now if you could, or are you happy supporting Portland?
I think I'll take the Blazers, but I think the margin is a little slimmer than some might think. I think that there's a lot of things to be, cautiously optimistic about in Washington. I do like just some of the simple restraints that the Portland Trailblazers don't have a little bit more than what's going on in Washington. We talked about the hard cap, being hard capped at the first apron, potentially a little more flexibility to make a move right now. That I love that because we need to make moves. I don't have the anticipation that we're about to make some big trade that's going to get us a championship next year or anything like that. I would just as soon, not be great this year and try to get my fellow Mainer to our team. So that would be fantastic if that happened. But I'm also not holding my breath there. We have a bad history at the top of the draft. So only team in NBA history to pass on Michael Jordan, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and
Kevin Durant.
Yeah, we're the only team to pass on all three.
Not great.
Shout out CJ McCollum. Thank you for everything you did. I'm happy with what you gave us in the Giannis draft, but Giannis got a ring. So I do like where we're at, long story short, but I think that there's things to be positive about on both sides.
Matt, what is it that you want to see from the Wizards this year? You sort of expressed some frustration with Bilal not getting enough minutes right out of the gate. Are you willing to watch real mediocrity if it means the likes of Bub Carrington, Keyshawn George, Alex Sara getting heavy minutes in their debut seasons?
Yeah, like I don't need to see 20 minutes a game of Rashawn Holmes at this point. If it means Alex Sara is playing like 8 a game, as like the last big off the bench. It's just they've got to kind of have their priorities straight. Now, it's one thing if you're trying to feature one of those guys to some extent to trade him at the deadline. So the first half of the year, first third of the year, you need to give them a little bit more minutes than you'd like to. Like, I can live with that. Hey, we really want to see if we can flip Brogdon for something. Cool. We're going to start him out of the gate. That's like all well and good. It's just if we're in March and Poole has got a 30% usage and Kuzma's got a 30% usage and Brogdon is still playing 20-some minutes a game and Valanciunas is still on the roster and he's getting 9 post-ups a game, and just like stuff like that are things that they've just got to start to figure out a little more quickly, like who's in their long-term plans. Like Corey Kispert is like due for an extension here. Can you sign him to another cheap deal? Like, I think that's when you ask Judd about where the two teams are in terms of a rebuild so far, like I think Portland's got a lot more pieces and assets and can flip guys they have now for more pieces and assets. I do think the long-term contract situation is worse in Portland, whereas that's the one thing that the Wizards front office has done so far is like get guys on really good, manageable, like team-friendly deals. So if they can get Kispert for 10 a year or something like that, I mean, that'd be terrific. It's just, they've got to figure out guys like that. Is he going to be here long-term? What do you do with Johnny Davis? Like maybe one of the worst picks in lottery history, to be honest. Like I feel bad saying that, but like he hasn't been like a meaningful G League player yet. He makes another $5 million next year as well. So like you got to start to figure out what you do with some of these fringe guys at some point here too. So even if they just use this year to just get a better sense of where they are and take stock of people in the rebuild, which I think is kind of what Portland did a decent amount last year.
Yeah.
I think that'd be like a meaningful first step. And yeah, we're also going to fight really hard for that guy from Maine if we can do it.
Yeah. Not to jump right in here, Jack, but I think that Matt said a lot of things that are important to look at when you compare the two teams. And it's interesting, while we're in similar positions or like moving on from franchise cornerstones in the last year and everything, there's some similarities to the rebuild, but I feel like there's almost this sense of maybe Portland and Washington are a year apart.
Yeah.
And the fact that, don't get me wrong, Washington has some advantages in terms of the contract situation. Portland played a lot of young guys last year. I think we had four rookies in our top 6 games played last year, which is awesome. That just means they're getting minutes. Don't get me wrong, 2 of those guys are older rookies, so it's not like they have the highest possible ceiling in terms of being a prospect, but the guys that we have a shot to either build around or try to move on from, as you're alluding to, Matt, with like Corey Kispert and stuff like that, we got them some run, and they're kind of known quantities now to a certain extent. They're a little bit more marketable in terms of, if they need to be trade pieces, they're known value. So we're almost like a year ahead in that sense, because we only had a young roster to play last year.
Yep.
I think that's an interesting dynamic between the 2 different rebuilds when you compare them. But I do like the flexibility Washington has in terms of a lot of the contract situations. You mentioned Rashawn Holmes, you mentioned Anthony Gill, serviceable players to a certain extent, but you got to get off those contracts. Worst case scenario, as far as I know, they're non-guaranteed after this year. So even if you can't move them, you can move on from them.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that's just favorable for them. They don't have the albatross that is Jeremy Grant's contract, but yeah, it's just an interesting, like somewhat parallel with just these little minute differences. It's like they're such similar situations, but at the same time, so vastly different.
Yeah, Portland did a really, really good job last year, sort of cycling through Chris Murray, Tumani Kamara, Ryan Rupert, Delano Banton towards the end of the year. I think Jabari Walker got a lot of run as well, to the point where if you don't have these star guys, you may as well sort of give all these guys a lot of run, just sort of figure out what you really have. Matt, are there any players on the Wizards that you look at and you think, how we don't have Michael Jordan at the shooting guard, we don't have Shaquille O'Neal at the center, etc. Any guys sort of on the fringes of the roster, any like 2nd round picks that you're looking at and thinking, I might want to see them get some run this year, even if they're not going to bring the same level of impact as slightly more established players bring on the roster?
I think that's an area where Portland is like done way better than Washington. Like you've gotten a lot of guys like with low draft capital that could actually be like meaningful role players on good teams, probably like as soon as this year. You just mentioned a whole bunch of them. You throw Duop Reith in there, like guys like that. Like could have Bryce McGowan's turn into like a Mike Graves scorer for somebody on a 2-way? Like there's some excitement, I think, with guys like that you've got cheap long-term rotation pieces where that doesn't really exist anywhere on the Wizards roster other than guys they just took 1st-round picks on. Like the only one is maybe Jared Butler, and he spent most of last year on a 2-way. I think he's probably never more than like your 3rd point guard, but I think he could be like a really like serviceable 3rd point guard. It's just, this is a guy that's going to be like an end of rotation guy. Whereas like, I don't know if Jabari Walker turns into like a good 5th starter somewhere down the road, like that wouldn't shock me or anything like that.
Are there any guys that you look at around the league where I think it's maybe a little bit tougher in Portland, Judd, because you do have more prospects sort of across the positional spectrum? But Matt, I look at the Wizards and I do think that they're one of the few teams that can actually take a almost like Denny Avdija style gamble and make a trade for a young player that's perhaps not worked out in their current situation and give them some run. There are multiple ways to skin a cat. You can go out there and you can get another interesting young guy. Like I look at Detroit, for example, and I see 3 or 4 guys where you think, how are they going to get minutes this year? Who's going to be the odd man out? Is there anyone that you look at around the league and you think, I wouldn't mind seeing our front office go and make a play for them?
Yeah, shameless plug. I just did an article for Bulls Forever last week where I suggested that Santi Aldama for Memphis would be like a really interesting piece for someone like Washington, because you could play him next to Sarr longer term. I think the shooting potential is there, that maybe he spaces it enough to make up for the fact that Sarr is a couple years away from probably, even being a serviceable shooter. And he was like a sneaky good rim protector. He doesn't get a lot of blocks, but he's a pretty good deterrent. And so I think someone like that might actually complement Sarr pretty well. And I don't see him having like a super big pathway to a lot of minutes again this year in Memphis unless somebody gets hurt. Like if Jaren Jackson is back, if Zach Edey looks as good as they're hyping him up to be so far in camps and stuff like that, like, okay, like where do you get Aldama on the floor? Brandon Clark is presumably back from injury.
Mm-hmm.
There's just kind of a logjam of like solid front court pieces there. So if I'm them, maybe I need some shooting on the perimeter and I would want to flip Aldama for Kispert and something, or, they're both due for a contract. They make similar-ish money. So something like that might be kind of a, intriguing idea for both teams, I think.
It's a fun one. You sort of slyly get Alex Sarr to play the 5, even if he doesn't want to, by bringing in another 7'4", where it's like, look, Santi's the 5. Don't worry, you go and do your 4 stuff, but we're just going to run pick and roll with you, and we're going to ask you to defend the rim. All right, I like that, and I know that Brian Favali, another guy that I podcasted with a bit earlier this month, sort of shouted out Santi as one of the more underrated players in the league. 7 foot, pass and feel, great shooting touch. I really don't think that's a bad idea. Judd, do you have anyone where, sort of speaking about Anthony Simons and Shaden Sharp and Scoot Henderson, it's a riskier proposition, but you could almost imagine sort of a challenge trade taking place where you go to another rebuilding team and you say, hey, we've got too many guards, you've got too many wings. Anyone out there that you think I'd be willing to swap one of my guys for?
It's tough because I think we have such a logjam. Don't get me wrong, we're not a logjam in terms of pieces that are helping us win, but it's such a logjam in terms of, the three-headed monster in the backcourt and kind of figuring out what we're going to do at the center position because we have pieces there.
Yep.
I kind of want to just like play it out. I'm not necessarily, because I know we're not in a position to win right now. It's not like any one piece we go out and get is going to necessarily move the needle for me. There's a bunch of guys I dream about. Don't get me wrong in terms of like, oh, that would be awesome to see them as Blazers. Leaning back on a trade we alluded to with the Pelicans, if we were to move on from DeAndre Ayton and the stars aligned and we could somehow get like a Trey Murphy, who, don't get me wrong, is a different caliber player than we're talking about, I'd be more willing to part with someone like Shaden Sharp or some, one of the guards if it meant taking on another prospect who kind of fits that mold of a switchable perimeter defender, can play multiple positions, shoot at a high clip, good discipline, all those positive things. That's kind of the way I look at it. Like, unless we're going out and getting a piece that's like a little more of a known quantity, and so maybe a different caliber player than we were just talking about, like, I don't know that I want to make a move. I would have loved a guy like Koulibaly. Don't get me wrong, another lottery pick. So still, I would say a different caliber player than what we were just talking about. But it's guys like that. If we were to add anybody, someone who can play the 3 and 4 comfortably, I think would be important for us right now. Switchable defender, maybe can even guard some really more explosive guards, some smaller guys if needed in a pinch. That would be great. Point of attack, some type of stuff. No one jumps out to mind, or no one comes right to mind, just because it's like there's so much uncertainty with what we have right now. I kind of want to just play that out, and it's like there's so many guys out there that would make us better, but can't really pinpoint one, and we don't want to be too much better right now anyway. I think funny enough, Denny would probably, if you had asked me before the Denny trade, I think he would have been the guy I would have probably picked. But again, different caliber of player, I think.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Jack, like it's really interesting looking at that Portland roster for that reason. Like, you got a couple high volume guards potentially there. You've got a couple bigs that you probably have to play. And you've got a couple like 3-4 kind of guys, like somebody that can guard the 2-3s a little bit better. Like, presumably it'd be nice if Sharp could do some of that given his tools, but that really seems to be like kind of the one piece. But at some point, like, they're going to have to start to make some decisions on who to prioritize in terms of like development, because you probably can't play all of Chris Murray, Jabari Walker, Tamani Kamara, Ryan Repair, like, and have Denny and Jeremy Grant and guys like that still getting big minutes too. Like, somebody is going to fall through the cracks there a little bit. And could they be really good sweetener in a trade that, like, Judd's alluding to there? Like, could you throw in one of them to sweeten the deal with the DeAndre Ayton trade. Maybe somebody doesn't feel as bad taking on, that kind of salary if they're getting like another cheap young piece who could contribute with them. So it's going to be fun to see.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a really good point in terms of just having those. You alluded to it even earlier, Matt, when you said that Portland had just done a really good job with those sort of low in the draft guys that potentially have turned into mini assets for them. But when you sort of combine them with bigger pieces, you start to open up a lot more optionality, and you perhaps protect some of your future draft capital going forward, where you don't have to give up a first to go and get this guy. You can say, hey, have one of our guys that we've been developing, not take your pick, but we'll sort of go through and we'll figure something out. I think I probably want to close on sort of starting fives going into the year. And if you guys could have one thing happen aside from win the 2025 draft lottery, what would you want to happen with your respective teams this year? So, Judd, do you want to go first? What's going to be the starting lineup on opening night, and what, if one thing could happen in Portland this year, what would it be?
Let's see. The starting lineup definitely is a question mark for all the reasons we've been talking about, especially that guard position. I think you got to commit to Scoot, so he's got to be your one.
Yeah.
In the perfect world, Simons would be the two. And you would continue to bring Shaden off the bench. I think the justification there would be, especially because he's coming off injury, maybe be that explosive scorer off the bench, be our sixth man, let him kind of run in that role. That would mean for the three, it's tough because it's like, where do you want to go from there? I think I am arguably the biggest Toumani Camara fan that's ever lived. I have really high hopes for him, even though if I understand his ceiling, I can probably jump and touch it. I'm not a very tall guy. That all being said, I would love to see him continue to be an important piece in the starting lineup. So we'll peg him in at the 3. I think you're taking an offensive step back. I think in terms of spacing, you got to have Duop Reith at the 4 potentially, but potential stretch 4. See what you can do with him and Klingon, or him and Scoot, and bring Klingon off the bench is where I was going to go with that. And I think you got to start DeAndre Ayton. I think Ayton helps the deficiencies Reith has in terms of being a rebounder and defender, as long as Ayton is committed to playing that role. And yeah, so I would say Scoot, Ant, Toumani Camara, Duop Reith, and DeAndre Ayton. We'll see if it ends up playing that. You got to start Jeremy Grant if he's on that roster. So I would say Grant in place of Reith is the most likely spot I'm wrong. But in a perfect world, seeing what we can get out of these guys, that's what I would do. That being said, what move do I want to see happen, or what would I like?
If one thing could happen with the roster this year, one thing comes out of this season, what would it be? And also, got to say, Denny's got to be in that starting lineup somewhere. Surely.
Oh, yeah. Right? Wow. Sorry. See, this is maybe
I was wondering. I didn't want to be the Denny homer on the podcast.
Yeah, no, thank you. I don't know how I completely blanked on that, especially because he's been such a focal point of this whole pod. Sorry. Yeah. He has to squeak into that 3 position. And then I would personally say at that point, it's got to be Grant or Camara at the 4. I put Denny at the 3. The guards remain the same. Denny at the 3, Camara or Grant at the 4, and Ayton at the 5. I think that was a big mistake there on my part, but we'll see how it plays out.
It's fine. We will absolutely edit that out. Guys, my cat is freaking out in the sitting room. I'm just going to go and have a quick look to see what's going on. Matt, I can still hear you while I'm going and having a look. Why don't you tell us about the Wizards starting 5 that you want to see going into this year, and then we'll go on closing things that we want to see to happen with the roster.
Sure. Yeah. I think for the Wizards, it's kind of a similar thing where there's like at least 1, maybe 2 spots where you got to figure out what to do. And Judd, I really empathize with where you're at there of like, there's probably a better guy on the roster right now, but long-term piece, I'd really rather see what, this younger guy can do. So for the Wizards, they're going to start Poole at the 1. The 3's got to be Koulibaly, and the 5's going to be Valanciunas. I think there's no world where they don't start Kuzma. So that becomes like, well, now you have to bring Sarr off the bench. And I think, unless he looks amazing in camp, you can get away with that in year 1 of like slowly bringing him along. So that's fine. And then the 2 spot is really like, do you bring in Brogdon or do you bring in Kispert? Kispert gives you a little more size, but Brogdon's probably the better defender, and he might actually be as good a shooter as Kispert at this point too. So, but also bringing Brogdon as a stabilizer off the bench to kind of run that second unit makes a little bit of sense too. And that way you're not asking like Bub Carrington as a rookie to come in and run second units by himself. Like Brogdon can offset a little of the creation stuff there, but I think there's a good percentage of Washington fans that want to see Sarr start from day one, regardless of how he looks. Like I'm okay easing our way into that, and maybe if you trade Kuzma at some point, then you start Sarr, or something like that. But could you go with a huge lineup of Poole, Kispert, or Poole, Koulibaly, Kuzma, Sarr, Valanciunas? Like that's a really tough unit from a floor spacing perspective. It's a lot of size, but teams are just going to dare pretty much everyone on that court to shoot. So it's just, there's a lot of question marks, and maybe not in a good way. Like whereas Portland, I think there's like a couple viable options at each of those kind of wing spots, and that's a much better position to be in. I think that goes back to this being that year further ahead in that rebuild. Like maybe next year for Washington, Carrington looks like he could be a starter, or Keyshawn George plays his way into being that kind of piece. So I don't know. There's still some question marks. It's just more like, do you start with vets and try to be solid, or do you go full young guy? And I think that's really kind of the thing they have to decide for themselves.
Matt, would you just give us a very quick recap of your starting 5 there for me?
Yeah, I think for me, it would probably be Poole, Kispert, Koulibaly, Kuzma, Valanciunas.
Fair enough. And Sarr sort of coming in as one of the first guys off the bench, and then you gradually transition towards him starting later in the year.
I think something like that would be how I would probably go about it. And then again, whether you start Kispert or Brogdon, the other one is a stabilizer next to Bub and Sarr off the bench, and one of the other big, I don't know, could you play Marvin Bagley and Sarr together or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm so sorry I was away for so long. Another cat had got into my house, which has never happened in 7 years of having a cat. So I literally ran into my sitting room and
brought a friend home.
Oh my God. Yeah, my cat was howling out there, like making noises I've never heard. And I thought, this can't just be because I've left you alone to podcast for an hour. So apologies for being gone for a while. This will be some like interesting podcast editing. Jud, what were you going to say, man? Let's get back into it.
So I think I really like a point Matt made about bringing Brogdon off the bench, and to connect it to the Sarr dilemma in terms of figuring out that starting lineup. I think there's value in bringing a former 6th man of the year off the bench to run that second unit, especially on a young team that could feature pretty prominent talents in that second unit. I think if you have to bring Sarr off the bench, bringing Brogdon off the bench is a must. I think pairing those two, having that vet that maybe can help him in some pick and roll situations, just other ways. Obviously, they play different positions, but hopefully he, like how Chris Paul's done so much for so many bigs in the past, having a veteran presence at the guard position, running that unit with Sarr could be really beneficial. And I kind of like how that looks. I think on paper, when you think of that as a possibility for Washington, it's like, oh, it can't be all bad. But don't get me wrong. I think, long story short, with both of us trying to figure out what our starting lineups would be, interestingly enough, we have a lot of intriguing pieces that and a lot of question marks where it's like, oh, wow, we're going to see a lot of potentially really fun, but potentially really bad.
Could be some clunky fits too.
Yeah, but it'll be interesting to see how the separate situations play out in that regard.
I think that's a really good point. And I think the same thing applies to Bub Carrington as well in that bench unit, where if you were to say to Jordan Poole, hey, go and run the bench again, and you put Bub Carrington in that lineup, the poor guy's just never going to see the ball. So makes far more sense to have those two sort of paired together along with Sarr. And that way you have a guy that can just sort of guide 2 rookies through bench minutes. And it's also a really good thing to have those guys ease in against like not the best of the best that the NBA has to offer. I think we've seen guys like Walker Kessler thrive playing against second units, certainly last year, where it sort of seemed like a really strange decision on Will Hardy's part, but really it's just, he's absolutely ready to play against this level. Is he ready to play against this level? This is something that we can sort of work out. So yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on there, Jud. in terms of the one thing that you want to happen for the Blazers this year, it can be like player progression. It can be a record. The only thing that is barred is winning the 2025 draft lottery. So just tell me what it is that you want to see.
Well, all right. Thank you for taking the easy answer. No, I would say I'm ready to move on from that three-headed monster I alluded to earlier. Don't get me wrong. In a perfect world, I would love to see a Blazers team winning a bunch of games with Scoot and Shaden. But at the end of the day, I think for us to really start progressing in the direct, like one uniform aligned direction, we got to kind of determine what that situation is going to be and make a commitment there. I would like to see if it's Ant being moved, who we can get for him. And yeah, we'll see. I think he's the best piece we can move, other than maybe Aiden, that might bring in something to get excited about. That all being said, the thing I'm most excited about is that draft. So that's all my eggs are in that basket. So,
and that's one of the really fun things about talking about these two teams. I'm going to be really heavily scouting the 2025 NBA draft. So we're going to be in the DMs constantly together, guys, talking about who's going to fit where. And I know that, Matt, we certainly did at least one, maybe two mock drafts together where you were picking for the Wizards. I think you're a Steph Castle fan, if I remember correctly. We've gone for Alex Sarr. What do you want to see now that the Wizards sort of picked their direction? What do you want to see for the 24-25 season?
I just love to walk away feeling like Koulibaly has another gear, at least offensively, right? Like there was some, hey, in under 21, he really played some point guard growing up. Like we didn't get to see anything from him on ball last year. So I think if you can show he could be the ball handler in a pick and roll, like something like that would be awesome. Can he shoot 35% from three, stuff like that, I think would be huge, just to find out that there's like a step he's ready to take. Maybe the Olympics, he took some cool things away from some of the other vets. That sort of stuff, I think would be a nice, big takeaway from this year.
That's a great one. So I think that 18 months ago, Bilal Koulibaly was playing youth basketball in France. He wasn't even playing for, I think it was like the Mets 92 first team. He was one of these guys that really rose up the draft board incredibly late in 23. So there's absolutely reason to think that there's another step and another step on top of that with Bilal's game. It's just about sort of finding it this season. Guys, I've had a lot of fun talking about two of the teams that are going to be battling, tanking for flag, whatever it is that we're calling it this year. But I think that if we've got anything from this podcast, it's that there's definitely going to be value in watching these two teams. There's definitely going to be value in keeping up with Matt's coverage of the Wizards. Matt does, I think, the best Wizards podcast out there, over with Jahadi White as well, releasing content all the time. Jud, like we said, is an elite Twitter follow. I'm going to keep getting in your DMs, man, because can't just be doing random guest appearances. You've got to start putting yourself out there, doing your pod, writing your stuff, because you know too much about ball to just be hopping on the drop step. I love it. I'll have you anytime, but you're an elite ball knower. You've got to get out there, man. You've got to start covering the Blazers for us.
Well, as always, appreciate the opportunity to join you guys, Jack, and especially get to know you, Matt. And
likewise.
I always enjoy our conversations. And who knows, the more I do this, the more I get the itch to keep doing it. So whether it's another guest spot or, maybe getting my feet wet with some of my own Blazers content or just NBA content in general, we'll see what's coming down the line.
Excellent. Matt, have you got anything coming out in the next few days, next few weeks before the season starts that you want to plug? Or is it just check out the podcast, check out everything on the Twitter?
Yeah, believe in Wizards. I don't think there's a believe in Blazers right now, Judd. So if you want me to put in a word, let me know. I think you'd be great at it. But yeah, just happy to do this and chat with you guys, and be exciting to see where both these teams are, 6 months from now.
Yeah, guys, that is another episode of the Drop Step in the books. We're into September. We're nearly at the start of the 24-25 NBA seasons, but plenty of team previews to come. I'm still going to be featuring on the NBA pod this month with Mort Stig Jensen. So make sure to go and check out that feed if this one's looking a little dry. I am doing podcasts this month. You just got to go and find them. I'll leave the links to all of these guys' stuff in the description down below. Matt, Jud, thank you so much for coming on. Good luck putting up with your respective teams this year, your respective fan bases.
guys, if you want to know anything about the Wizards, make sure to go and check out Matt. If you want to know anything about the Blazers, if you want a elite Twitter follow, go and check out Judd, because like he said, he's got the itch. I'm sure stuff is coming. That is another episode of Drop Step. We will see you next week for another one. Thank you for tuning in. And yeah, NBA season, come on, let's get to it.